Hello there. Today, we're diving into the darkest corners of human history, where killers didn't just take lives, they spread fear beyond imagination. Here are the 6 most brutal serial killers in history of life monsters who once walked among us. 1. Andrei Chikatilo, the Butcher of Rostov. When I first read the case file of Andrei Chikatilo, my hands trembled not from fear, but from the overwhelming weight of what one man could do. Born in 1936 in the war-torn Soviet Union, Chikatilo grew up in a landscape ravaged by famine, violence, and silence. That silence would follow him and serve him well in the dark. He was not an obvious monster. A former school teacher with soft speech and a weak frame, Chikatilo was dismissed by most who met him as unremarkable. But beneath the quiet facade was a man tormented by impotence, humiliation, and a compulsive need to dominate. His crimes were not random. They were ritualistic acts of vengeance against a world that rendered him powerless. Between 1978 and 1990, Chikatilo murdered at least 52 victims, mostly women and children. The pattern was chilling. He would lure his victims near train stations or secluded paths, offering them candy, money, or promises of work. Once isolated, he would strike with sudden, frenzied violence, stabbing, mutilating, and often gouging out eyes, believing they could capture his soul. But the true horror wasn't just the brutality, it was the cold precision. Chikatilo operated under the noses of Soviet authorities for over a decade, exploiting a flawed justice system obsessed with appearances. In one tragic twist, another man was even executed for one of Chikatilo's murders, a grim testament to the state's desperation to maintain control. What set Chikatilo apart from other killers was his psychological profile. He wasn't driven purely by sadism, nor just by sexual desire. Forensic psychiatrists later diagnosed him with a borderline personality disorder, sadistic tendencies, and schizoid features. His impotency became the root of his rage hiss, inability to perform sexually translated into a savage need to kill. With every victim, he wasn't just taking a life, he was reclaiming a twisted sense of manhood. But even monsters stumble. Chikatilo's downfall came not from a mistake in his method, but from relentless surveillance and psychological profiling by Soviet investigator Viktor Burakov. For years, Burakov chased shadows, frustrated by political interference and archaic police techniques. But through profiling and sheer obsession, he closed in. In 1990, Chikatilo was finally caught after being spotted loitering suspiciously near a train station. The interrogation was a battle of wills. Chikatilo resisted for days, but once he began confessing, the details flowed with disturbing calm. He drew maps, named victims, even described the sounds they made as they died. At trial, he sat in a steel cage, man the court deemed too dangerous to even breathe the same air as others. In 1994, Andrei Chikatilo was executed by a single gunshot to the head. His final words were never recorded. But his legacy endures in blood and silence, proof that evil can wear the plainest face and that the worst monsters walk in daylight. 2. Albert Fish, the boogeyman of 20th century America. Some killers leave behind patterns, others nightmares. Albert Fish left behind both. When investigators first opened his letters, they thought they were reading fiction macabre, unimaginable horror tales. But the truth was far worse. This wasn't the script of a madman, it was a confession. Albert Fish was born in 1870 in Washington, D.C., into a family riddled with mental illness. From a young age, he exhibited disturbing behaviors, self-harm, masochism, and an obsession with religious punishment. He would insert needles into his groin and beat himself with a nail-studded paddle. But the darkness inside Fish only deepened with time. Fish's crimes began with an urge not just to harm, but to consume. Between the 1920s and 1930s, he claimed to have molested over 100 children, but it was the murder and cannibalization of 10-year-old Grace Budd in 1928 that shocked the nation and cemented his infamy. He lured Grace under the pretense of taking her to a birthday party. Instead, he brought her to an abandoned house, strangled her, and over the course of days, ate parts of her body. Years later, he sent a detailed letter to her mother, describing what he did with chilling indifference. It took me 9 days to eat her entire body. This wasn't merely perversion. It was a spiritual delusion fused with sadism. Fish believed he was fulfilling divine punishment. He referenced passages from the Bible to justify his acts and claimed God instructed him to sacrifice children as penance. The boundaries between his religious hallucinations and real-world horror collapsed entirely. Inside his mind was a warped universe where pain equaled purity and innocence needed to be defiled to set it free. Psychiatrists later described him as a psychiatric phenomenon, a sadomasochist, a schizophrenic and possibly psychotic, yet alarmingly coherent. He functioned in daily life, holding jobs, raising children, even writing poetry. The investigation into Grace Budd's disappearance stretched for 6 years, but it was that haunting letter mail to her family that finally cracked the case. The stationery bore a tiny clue, an emblem from a New York lodging house. Investigators traced it back, leading to Albert Fish's arrest in 1934. In court, the jury was forced to listen to the details of his crimes in full. Many cried. Some became physically ill. Even hardened detectives admitted they'd never heard anything so depraved. Still, Fish's defense pleaded insanity, and in truth it wasn't far from it, but the jury chose death. Albert Fish was executed by electric chair in 1936 at Sing Sing prison. As he was strapped in, he reportedly whispered, "It will be the supreme thrill." The man who once called himself the Gray Man and the Werewolf of Wisteria died with the same calm that marked his crimes. But for many Americans, Albert Fish wasn't just a criminal. He was evil incarnate, the boogeyman made real. His case changed how America viewed mental illness, child protection, and what one human could do to another. 3. Pedro Lopez, the Shadow of the Andes. In all my years investigating the darkest corners of human behavior, few names send a chill down my spine quite like Pedro Lopez. He wasn't a killer in the traditional sense. He was a wanderer, moving silently across borders, a ghost leaving tragedy in his wake. Pedro Alonso Lopez was born in 1948 in a harsh and unforgiving part of Colombia. His early life was defined by poverty, abandonment, and violence. As a child, he lived on the streets, experiencing trauma that shaped him in deeply disturbing ways. What began as survival gradually turned into something far more sinister. Lopez's crimes stretched across Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, where he targeted vulnerable communities in remote and impoverished areas. For years, disappearances of young girls went largely unnoticed, dismissed as runaways or lost to the dangers of rural life. Lopez exploited this silence. His movements were erratic, but his pattern was not. He gained trust quickly, knew where to look, and vanished before questions were even asked. What makes Lopez's case so unsettling is not only the scale of the crimes he confessed to over 300 disappearances, but the way he recounted them. His memory was methodical. He spoke not with rage, but with disturbing calm and clarity. He led authorities to grave sites, described timelines, even noted weather conditions. In 1980, authorities in Ecuador arrested Lopez after a series of tragic discoveries in the Ambato region. Initially skeptical of his claims, investigators soon realized that the locations he identified aligned with real, unsolved missing persons cases. The puzzle pieces fit, the map he drew led them to truth. Psychological evaluations revealed a man detached from empathy but driven by deep-seated compulsions. Experts described him as suffering from severe antisocial traits, showing no remorse and expressing disturbing justifications for his behavior. He didn't act from passion or revenge, he acted from an internal urge, a ritualistic need to dominate and erase. Lopez was ultimately convicted and sentenced under Ecuadorian law at the time, which imposed a maximum penalty far below what his crimes warranted. After serving less than 2 decades, he was released in the late 1990s. He was briefly held again in Colombia for psychiatric evaluation, but then, astonishingly, he disappeared. To this day, Pedro Lopez remains a fugitive. His name occasionally resurfaces in rumors and unconfirmed reports, but there's no official record of his current location. His vanishing serves as a grim reminder that even in the age of modern justice systems, some predators slip through the cracks. What haunts investigators most is not only what he did, but what he might still be capable of. In cases like Lopez's, we are forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the system fails, and when it does, the consequences echo far beyond courtrooms and headlines. 4. Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. Some killers are erratic. Some leave trails of chaos. But Gary Ridgway was different organized, methodical, emotionless. He didn't kill out of rage. He killed out of routine. Ridgway earned his nickname the Green River Killer after. Several victims were found near the Green River in Washington state during the early 1980s. But the true scope of his crimes would take decades to unravel. In the end, it was revealed that Ridgway was the most prolific convicted serial killer in American history, officially connected to 49 victims, though he confessed to 71, and investigators believe the real number could be over 90. Born in 1949 in Salt Lake City, Ridgway's early life offered subtle clues of what was to come. He was a quiet, withdrawn child, with a strict and sometimes volatile home life. He struggled in school, especially with reading, and was known for his low self-esteem. But it was his relationship with his mother domineering, shaming, and highly controlling that many psychologists point to as the root of his conflicted attitudes toward women. Ridgway later admitted to having violent fantasies as early as adolescence. He joined the Navy in his 20s and served in Vietnam. But when he returned to civilian life, the fantasies grew stronger and soon turned into action. His victims were often vulnerable women, some involved in high-risk lifestyles, which he later claimed made them easy to kill. He'd often lure them in his pickup truck, gain their trust, and then, in isolated areas, commit the crimes with chilling calm. Many of the victims were found in wooded areas, near rivers or ravines dumped, covered with brush, or left in clusters. What made Ridgway so difficult to catch was his unassuming life. He worked for over 30 years as a truck painter. He was married multiple times. He attended church regularly. To those who knew him casually, he seemed mild, even forgettable. That camouflage allowed him to operate for 2 decades without detection. But behind that mask was a man who planned his killings like errands. He kept souvenirs, he revisited crime scenes, and he continued working his day job as if nothing happened. For Ridgway, murder wasn't just impulse, it was habit. In the early 2000s, advances in DNA forensics finally caught up to him. Cold case evidence from the 1980s was re-examined, and new technology linked Ridgway to several victims. He was arrested in 2001, and under interrogation, he began to confess not out of guilt, but with the detachment of someone discussing a grocery list. "I killed so many women, I have a hard time keeping them straight," he told investigators. Ridgway ultimately accepted a plea deal to avoid the death penalty. In exchange for cooperation and full disclosure, he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. His statements helped investigators locate dozens of additional remains. Today, Gary Ridgway resides in Washington State Penitentiary, serving multiple life sentences. He shows little remorse and even less understanding of the lives he destroyed. What chills me most is not the number of victims, but the fact that for so many years, he blended into everyday life. It raises a haunting question for all of us. How well do we really know the people around us? 5. Ted Bundy, the charming face of evil. Ted Bundy wasn't the kind of man people feared. He was articulate, clean-cut, confident, exactly the kind of person we're taught to trust. And that's what made him deadly. Born in 1946 in Vermont, Bundy's early life was cloaked in deception. He was raised believing his grandparents were his parents and that his mother was his sister. That lead, combined with feelings of abandonment and confusion about his identity, would come to shape his fractured personality. By his teenage years, he was already showing signs of detachment, manipulation, and emotional coldness. But unlike many serial offenders, Bundy didn't strike from the shadows. He walked among discerning degrees, dating, volunteering at suicide hotlines, even getting involved in politics. He crafted an image, and it worked. That mask of charm was his most dangerous weapon. Between 1974 and 1978, Bundy murdered dozens of young women across 7 U.S. states. The true number is still unknown, but he confessed to 30 killings. His method was calculated. He would fake an injury using a sling or crutches and ask women for help near libraries, campuses, or parking lots. Once in his car, the facade vanished. He overpowered them with brutal force and took them to remote areas. Bundy didn't just kill. He staged, relived, and ritualized his crimes, often revisiting crime scenes long after the act. He displayed a chilling combination of narcissism and psychopathy. To him, his victims weren't people. They were objects' reflections of his need to control, dominate, and annihilate. Yet, despite the mounting cases, Bundy stayed steps ahead of law enforcement. He changed vehicles, cities, tactics. He escaped custody twice, once by jumping from a second-story courthouse window in Colorado, and again by slipping through a ceiling panel in jail. After his second escape, he traveled to Florida, where he committed one of his most savage attacks at the Chi Omega sorority house in 1978, killing 2 women and bludgeoning 2 others within minutes. Bundy was finally captured later that year while driving a stolen vehicle. When questioned, he denied everything at first, but gradually, as trial approached, cracks began to show. He represented himself in court, cross-examined witnesses, and manipulated the media with ease. His case became a national spectacle, a handsome, intelligent man accused of horrifying crimes. Some refused to believe it, others were drawn to it. But the evidence was overwhelming. Bite marks, witness testimony, and physical traces tied him to the murders. He was convicted and sentenced to death. On the 24th of January, 1989, Ted Bundy was executed in the electric chair. As he faced his final moments, he offered no real apology, only vague admissions of guilt. What makes Bundy so terrifying isn't just what he did, it's how normal he seemed. He shattered the stereotype of what a monster looks like. He reminded us that evil doesn't always come with snarls or shadows. Sometimes it smiles, shakes your hand, and tells you exactly what you want to hear. And for many, that realization was more terrifying than the crimes themselves. 6. Luis Garavito, the Beast of Colombia. When I first reviewed the Garavito case files, I had to stop halfway through. Not because the details were unclear, but because they were too clear. There is evil that shocks, and then there is evil that rewrites the boundaries of human cruelty. Luis Alfredo Garavito, born in 1957 in Colombia, is believed to be one of the most prolific serial killers ever recorded, with estimates placing his victim count at over 300 children. Even today, the full number may never be known. He operated in poor, rural areas across Colombia during the 1990s, a time when civil conflict, guerrilla warfare, and poverty left many children vulnerable and invisible. Garavito's early life was steeped in instability. He was raised in an abusive household, subjected to both physical and psychological trauma. Teachers described him as troubled, withdrawn, and volatile. By adolescence, he had begun showing signs of severe emotional disturbance, including violent outbursts and inappropriate behavior. But like many future offenders, no one intervened. His methods were manipulative and horrifyingly effective. He would disguise him sometimes as a priest, a teacher, or a disabled man to gain the trust of young boys. Once isolated, the crimes were committed in secluded fields or abandoned buildings, always following a disturbingly repetitive pattern. For Garavito, these weren't impulsive acts. They were ritualized, calculated, and premeditated. Investigators were initially overwhelmed. Dozens of bodies began to appear across multiple regions, all with similar characteristics. But no one realized they were dealing with a single predator until 1997, when a mass grave uncovered in southern Colombia revealed patterns too distinct to ignore. Garvido's capture was as strange as it was inevitable. Police found a discarded bag filled with notes, identification documents, and glasses items linked to the crimes. Through detailed forensic work and fingerprint matching, they tracked him down in 1999. When arrested, he confessed in chilling detail to hundreds of murders. The psychological profile compiled afterward was alarming. Garvido displayed traits of psychopathy, extreme narcissism, and compulsive behavior. He was also deeply manipulative, capable of appearing remorseful when it suited him. In private, however, he revealed no real guilt. He described his crimes with eerie detachment, often referencing his own trauma as a justification. Despite the scale of his crimes, Garvido was sentenced to 1,853 years in prison. But due to Colombian legal limits, he could serve no more than 40 years, and possibly even less with good behavior. That caused national outrage. In a country already scarred by conflict and injustice, the idea that a man responsible for so much suffering could one day walk free was unthinkable. In response, Colombia revised certain aspects of its criminal code, particularly regarding serial crimes and child exploitation. But the fact remains, Garvido may not spend the rest of his life behind bars. He is currently imprisoned under high security, though his health has reportedly declined in recent years. Authorities keep his location secret for fear of retaliation. Even within the prison system, his crimes are seen as unforgivable. Luis Garavito was not just a killer. He was a systemic predator, someone who weaponized trust, poverty, and vulnerability on an almost industrial scale. His case stands as a final, chilling reminder in this series. Monsters are not born in fairy tales. They are built in the real world, brick by brick, through neglect, trauma, and the cracks in our systems that let them thrive. From Chikatilo to Garavito, these 6 men remind us that evil is not one shape or sound. It hides in charisma, silence, and routine. It wears uniforms, glasses, and polite smiles. What binds them together is not just what they did, but how long they got away with it. Understanding these killers isn't about glorifying their actions. It's about learning how they operated, why they did what they did, and how we can stop it from ever happening again. Because the greatest horror is not the monster we see, it's the one we never suspected. Hello. Today, we uncover the darkest minds, killers so intelligent, they outwitted the law at every turn. Each story is a chilling game of intellect, deception, and deadly precision. Let's begin. 1. Rodney Alcala, the charming genius with a killer smile. When the FBI first reviewed Rodney Alcala's files, one thing stood out: the sheer number of inconsistencies. His crimes stretched across states, decades, and aliases, with a haunting pattern hidden beneath charisma and smiles. It was as if they were chasing a ghost with perfect teeth and a genius mind. Alcala's IQ was estimated to be near 160 higher than Einstein's. He studied film under Roman Polanski, spoke fluently on art and literature, and, perhaps most disturbingly, knew how to manipulate the system. Arrested in the early 1970s for the rape and attempted murder of an 8-year-old, Alcala served less than 3 years before being released. It was a glaring failure of justice, one that he would exploit repeatedly. Rodney didn't just commit murder, he orchestrated it like a symphony. He used photography as bait, luring young women and children under the guise of building modeling portfolios. With his camera in one hand and cruelty in the other, he documented their final moments. Hundreds of photos were later found, many remain unidentified. But what set Alcala apart wasn't just his brutality. It was his uncanny ability to hide in plain sight. In 1978, At the height of his killing spree, he appeared as a contestant on the popular show The Dating Game and won. Smiling, charming, and well-spoken, he completely fooled both the audience and the producers. One of the producers would later say he came off as a total gentleman. Beneath that gentleman facade was a man who studied criminal law in prison, later representing himself in court. During his trial, he cross-examined witnesses, quoted philosophers, and even played recordings of his own voice to confuse jurors. Prosecutors described it as a performance worthy of Broadway and just as rehearsed. But genius alone doesn't make a killer. What drove Alcala was something darker: the desire for control. Control over how he was seen, how the murders were carried out, and even how the trial unfolded. His victims were pawns in a game only he understood, one that spanned coastlines and decades. Rodney Alcala was finally convicted in 2010, more than 30 years after his first known murder. The delay wasn't due to lack of evidence, but because Alcala always stayed 2 steps ahead, a master of deception, a genius with blood on his hands. 2. Israel Keyes, the architect of the perfect crime. When investigators finally apprehended Israel Keyes in 2012, what they thought was a single abduction case quickly unraveled into something much darker and far more disturbing. What they had stumbled upon was not just a killer, but a criminal tactician unlike any they'd ever seen. Keyes didn't just murder, he engineered death like an artist designs a masterpiece, with precision, patience, and an eerie commitment to anonymity. Keyes was the embodiment of calculated chaos. Soft-spoken, intelligent, and fiercely disciplined, he studied the failures of other serial killers as if preparing for an exam. He refused to follow patterns. He avoided local victims. He never used the same weapon twice. Most chillingly, he stashed kill kits, buckets filled with guns, duct tape, cash, and disposal tools years in advance, buried across the United States, waiting for the right moment to strike. Born in Utah and raised in a radical, isolated family, Keyes grew up without television, phone, or outside contact. This early detachment from normalcy gave rise to a fascination with power and control. By his teenage years, he was already fantasizing about murder. He later confessed that his first victim was likely in the late 1990s, a couple he abducted while they were hiking. Their bodies were never found. That was part of his plan. He traveled extensively, renting cars and paying with cash, choosing victims at random in cities thousands of miles from home. Random is harder to track, he told the FBI, and harder to connect. He avoided surveillance cameras, chose isolated areas, and deleted all digital trails. It wasn't luck that kept him from being caught for over a decade. It was design. Keyes operated under a strict moral code, his own twisted version of ethics. He would not harm children. He avoided killing close to holidays. He refused to use credit cards during crimes. In one case, he flew from Alaska to Chicago, rented a car, drove over 1,000 miles to Vermont, murdered a couple in their home, and then returned days later, all without raising a single red flag. It wasn't until he broke his own rule, abducting 18-year-old Samantha Koenig in his home city of Anchorage, that the cracks began to form. He held her captive, killed her, and then used her phone and ATM card to mislead authorities. But the trail eventually led back to him. When captured, Keyes smiled. He knew what he had done was almost perfect. What terrified investigators most wasn't the number of victims, which he never fully disclosed, but how coldly methodical he had been. His murders weren't impulsive or emotional. They were projects, missions, puzzles he solved long before anyone knew they existed. Before he could be tried, Israel Keyes committed suicide in his cell. He left behind a cryptic suicide note filled with drawings, fragments of poetry, and one chilling truth. There is no one who knows me or who has ever known me, who knows anything about me. The case remains open. Some of his buried kill kits have never been found. And somewhere out there, the echoes of his untraceable murders still haunt cold case files. 3. Edmund Kemper, the killer who understood himself too well. When Edmund Kemper walked into the Santa Cruz Police Department in April 1973 and calmly confessed to murdering his mother, the officers didn't believe him. At 6 feet 9 inches tall and nearly 300 pounds, Kemper, nicknamed Big Ed, was a giant of a man. But what struck officers even more than his size was his intelligence. With an IQ of 145 and a cold, meticulous nature, Kemper wasn't just a killer, he was a self-aware monster. Born in California in 1948, Kemper's early life was steeped in psychological trauma. He was abused, emotionally isolated, and locked in a basement by his mother, a woman he would later describe as the root of all his hatred. By age 15, he murdered both his grandparents just to see what it felt like. After being institutionalized, doctors noted his extraordinary intellect and deep insight into his own pathology. Ironically, this intellect led to his early release at age 21. The system had believed him cured. It was one of its gravest errors. Kemper knew how to play people. He had charm. He volunteered with police officers, hung out in their favorite bars, and learned how investigations worked. They called him Big Ed and treated him like a harmless oddball, unaware he was listening for every tactical detail. It was part of his strategy. From 1972 to 1973, Kemper launched into a series of grisly murders in the Santa Cruz area. His victims were mostly young, female college students. He would pick them up while hitchhiking, often under the pretense of being friendly or helpful. Once inside his car, they were trapped. He disabled the handles, hid weapons, and wore a mask of gentle conversation right up until the moment he struck. But what made Kemper truly disturbing was not just the murders, it was the post-mortem rituals. He decapitated victims, kept body parts, and engaged in necrophilic acts. He later described his actions with clinical detachment, saying, "If I killed them, at least they were mine." His killings were not fueled by impulse, but by a deeply rooted compulsion to dominate physically, emotionally, sexually. The most chilling aspect, he knew he was evil. Kemper spoke openly in interviews and psychiatric evaluations, analyzing his own behavior with shocking clarity. He could explain the origin of his rage, the trigger of each murder, and the guilt that would come afterward. "I was the only one smart enough to know how screwed up I was," he said, "and too screwed up to do anything about it." In the end, Kemper turned himself in. After killing his mother, the ultimate object of his hatred, and her best friend, he realized he had completed his cycle. There was no one left to blame. Now serving 8 life sentences, Kemper has become a subject of criminal psychology and behavioral profiling. His interviews are still used by the FBI to understand other serial offenders. He remains eerily cooperative, articulate, and composed. A man who sees his own monstrosity and does not flinch. He is proof that intelligence without empathy is a weapon more dangerous than any knife or gun. And in the case of Edmund Kemper, that weapon was turned on innocence and on himself. 4. Ted Kaczynski, the genius who declared war on modern society. In a remote Montana cabin, devoid of electricity, running water, or human contact, one of the most intelligent domestic terrorists in American history handcrafted his own war against the modern world. Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, was not just a killer. He was a mathematician, philosopher, and recluse whose crimes stemmed not from chaos, but from chilling ideology. Born in 1942, Kaczynski was a child prodigy. He skipped 2 grades, entered Harvard at 16, and earned a PhD in mathematics from the University of Michigan. Professors described his intellect as brilliant, bordering on otherworldly. But behind his academic achievements lay a growing resentment, one that would fester into violent extremism. After resigning from a brief career in academia, Kaczynski withdrew from society altogether. He built a 10 by 12-foot cabin in Lincoln, Montana, living off the grid. It was there, isolated from the world he had grown to hate, that he conceived his plan to cripple the system through terror. Between 1978 and 1995, Kaczynski mailed or hand-delivered 16 homemade bombs to universities, airlines, and corporate executives. The devices were sophisticated, crafted with no fingerprints, made from scrap metal, batteries, and wood. Each was designed to maim or kill, and they did. His bombs injured 23 and killed 3, including a computer store owner and a Yale forestry professor. But what made the Unabomber unique wasn't just his ability to evade law enforcement, it was his manifesto. In 1995, Kaczynski sent a 35,000-word document titled Industrial Society and Its Future to major newspapers, threatening further violence unless it was published. The manifesto argued that technological advancement was destroying human freedom, dehumanizing society, and leading to ecological collapse. It wasn't incoherent rage, it was a calculated philosophical critique from a man who truly believed he was saving the world. Law enforcement was baffled. The FBI's investigation, codenamed Unabomb, University and Airline Bomber, became the longest and most expensive manhunt in U.S. history. Despite 17 years of forensic profiling and psychological analysis, the Unabomber left no digital trail. He used old-fashioned tools, wrote in block letters, and left almost no physical evidence. His capture came not from forensic genius, but from linguistic analysis and a brother's conscience. When the manifesto was published, David Kaczynski recognized the voice behind the words. He alerted the FBI, and agents arrested Ted in April 1996 at his cabin, surrounded by bomb-making materials and journal entries detailing every attack. In court, Kaczynski refused to plead insanity. He viewed himself as a political prisoner, not a madman. Eventually, to avoid the death penalty, he accepted life imprisonment without parole. He remained unrepentant, stating in later writings that he regretted only not doing more. Kaczynski's story isn't just about murder, it's about the horrifying intersection of intellect and ideology. His bombs weren't random, they were arguments, violent theses, delivered through wire and fire. He used his intelligence not to elevate humanity, but to strike at its core. He believed society had lost its soul to machines, and he sacrificed lives to prove his point. 5. Dr. Harold Shipman, the doctor of death who wrote his own death certificates. In the small, tight-knit town of Hyde, England, Dr. Harold Shipman was seen as a pillar of the community, a trusted family physician who made house calls, remembered birthdays, and offered comfort during the hardest moments of life. But behind that white coat was one of the most prolific serial killers in modern history. With a pen, a syringe, and a carefully constructed illusion of care, Shipman murdered over 200 patients, possibly more, all while being respected, trusted, and utterly unsuspected. Born in 1946, Shipman was the second of 4 children and showed early signs of academic brilliance. His mother, whom he adored, died of cancer when he was 17, an event that shaped his perception of death and control. Witnessing her receive morphine for pain and the calmness of her passing would later become a blueprint for how he took lives. He graduated from Leeds School of Medicine in 1970 and began practicing medicine. Early in his career, Shipman was caught forging prescriptions for opiates and briefly entered a drug rehabilitation program. But this warning sign was brushed aside. He resumed his career, eventually opening his own practice in Hyde, where his killing spree began in earnest. Shipman's method was chillingly simple. He administered lethal doses of diamorphine, medical heroin, to elderly patients, usually women, and then falsified their medical records and death certificates to cover his tracks. Most victims were found peacefully in their homes or hospital beds, their deaths attributed to natural causes. Families trusted his word implicitly. After all, he was the doctor. What set Shipman apart from other serial killers was not just his staggering victim count, it was the cold, clinical efficiency of his crimes. He didn't kill out of frenzy, jealousy, or rage. He killed because he could. His intellect, sharp and methodical, enabled him to manipulate systems, forge documents, and create a near-flawless facade. But the pattern began to crack in 1998, when the daughter of 81-year-old Kathleen Grundy, a well-known local woman, grew suspicious. Shipman had not only signed her death certificate, but also had a bizarrely worded will drafted, in which she left nearly her entire estate to him. The daughter, a lawyer, contacted authorities. That was the beginning of Shipman's unraveling. Exhumations revealed lethal levels of diamorphine in multiple bodies. An audit of his patient records showed disturbing spikes in death rates, particularly during his work hours. Police eventually discovered that Shipman had been killing for decades, undetected. The final toll? At least 215 confirmed deaths. Some estimates pushed the number over 250. In 2000, Shipman was convicted of 15 counts of murder and 1 count of forgery, sentenced to life imprisonment. He never admitted guilt, never showed remorse. In 2004, he hanged himself in his prison cell, a final act of control over a life system he had manipulated so expertly. Harold Shipman didn't need to hide in shadows or alleyways. He wore a stethoscope, not a mask. His genius wasn't in his escape, it was in his deception. He weaponized trust, cloaked himself in authority, and quietly became one of history's deadliest predators. 6. Jack the Ripper, the phantom genius who vanished without a trace. No name in criminal history conjures more mystery, dread, and obsessive speculation than Jack the Ripper. Between August and November of 1888, this faceless figure terrorized London's East End, brutally murdering at least 5 women, all prostitutes, and vanishing without leaving behind a single definitive clue. More than a century later, the Ripper's identity remains one of the most infamous unsolved enigmas in criminal investigation. But what made this killer so uniquely terrifying wasn't just the gore, it was the chilling intelligence behind the spectacle. The Ripper didn't just kill, he orchestrated horror. His victims were mutilated with surgical precision, organs removed with anatomical knowledge, throats cut swiftly and efficiently. Investigators quickly suspected they were dealing with someone educated, perhaps even a doctor or a butcher. Yet, in the grim alleys of Whitechapel, there were hundreds of such men, and the Ripper seemed to know that. He chose his victims carefully. All were impoverished women, living transient lives in the slums, which made their disappearances seem almost inevitable to a society that already saw them as disposable. But what he did to their bodies and how he left them was anything but random. Each murder escalated in brutality and theatricality. By the time Mary Jane Kelly, the Ripper's final canonical victim, was found in her room, her corpse had been eviscerated nearly beyond recognition. Her organs were spread across the bed like a grotesque message. And then, silence. The Ripper stopped, or he moved, or died. No one knows, but his sudden disappearance was as calculated as his entrance. He left behind no fingerprints, no eyewitnesses, no definitive murder weapon, and, most infuriating of all, no clear motive. Instead, he left only questions and fear. The psychological profile that modern experts have constructed paints a chilling picture. Jack the Ripper likely had a high IQ, an intimate knowledge of both human anatomy and urban geography, and a deep hatred toward women, specifically prostitutes, whom he may have viewed as the source of personal trauma or humiliation. He craved power, not just over his victims, but over the public and press. And he got it. He toyed with authorities through letters, some signed Jack the Ripper, others smeared with blood. Whether authentic or hoaxes, the letters fueled panic and media frenzy. London was gripped by hysteria. Police flooded Whitechapel. Citizens formed vigilante groups. Newspapers sold by the millions. All the while, the Ripper watched from the shadows, perhaps even walking among the investigators, amused by their desperation. Despite hundreds of suspects and decades of theories ranging from royal conspiracies to deranged artists, no one has ever been definitively identified. And that, perhaps, is his final masterpiece. Jack the Ripper wasn't just a killer, he was an enigma, a symbol of how intelligence, when driven by madness and cloaked in mystery, can become a myth that outlives truth. He outwitted 19th century law enforcement with tactics still baffling to modern criminologists. He became the prototype for every smart killer who would follow, precise, theatrical, untraceable. Jack the Ripper disappeared, but his legacy never did. These 6 killers weren't just murderers, they were masterminds. Each wielded intelligence like a weapon. Ocala used charm and law, Keyes used systems and planning, Kemper wielded self-awareness, Kaczynski ideology, Shipman authority, and the Ripper mystery itself. In a world where justice relies on patterns, these predators shatter the rules. And in doing so, they remind us of the most frightening truth in criminal psychology. The smartest monsters often look nothing like monsters at all.
Hello. From the frozen forests of Canada to the lovers' lanes of Virginia, 6 chilling cases, 6 nameless shadows, and not a single conviction. In this video, you'll enter the world of serial murderers who vanished without a trace, where fear lasts longer than justice. Are you ready? 1. The Long Island serial killer, Lisk, the ghost of Gilgo Beach. It began with a phone call. On May 1st, 2010, 24-year-old Shannon Gilbert dialed 911 in a frantic panic, claiming someone was after her. She was last seen running barefoot through the quiet gated community of Oak Beach, Long Island. The call lasted 23 chilling minutes, but when police arrived, Shannon was gone. Months later, during a routine training exercise, a K-9 unit stumbled upon something unexpected: human remains. As authorities combed the desolate stretch of Gilgo Beach off Ocean Parkway, they uncovered more bodies, 4 within mere days. All were women, all wrapped in burlap sacks. All had worked as escorts, and this was only the beginning. By 2011, the body count had risen to at least 10 victims, with some estimates suggesting more. Among them were women, a man dressed in women's clothing, and even a toddler. Many had been missing for years. All were disposed of with clinical precision, suggesting an organized, methodical predator, likely with experience in law enforcement or medical knowledge. What made this case so haunting wasn't just the brutality, it was the silence. No known suspect, no solid forensic evidence, no clear motive. Whoever Lisk was, he didn't act out of sudden rage. His killings were premeditated, patterned, and patient. He stalked the edges of society, targeting sex workers, people he believed wouldn't be missed. He used burner phones, fake names, and encrypted communications to lure victims. He watched them vanish into the void, certain he would not be caught. And for over a decade, he wasn't. The psychological profile crafted by FBI profilers pointed to a white male, aged 30 to 50, intelligent, possibly married, and living in or near Long Island. He likely held a job that allowed him privacy, mobility, and control. The way he wrapped bodies and spaced his kills hinted at someone who viewed the victims as disposable objects, trophies rather than people. Then in 2023, a major break. Investigators arrested Rex Heuermann, a married Manhattan architect, in connection to the first 4 victims, the Gilgo 4. DNA evidence and digital forensics linked him to the crimes. He matched the profile almost too perfectly. But here's the twist. Many experts now believe Heuermann may not be the only killer. The varied MOs, different victim types, and time gaps suggest more than one person may be responsible. The Long Island serial killer case leaves us with questions more disturbing than answers. What if there are multiple predators working the same area? What if one of them is still out there, waiting, watching? The shadows of Gilgo Beach still whisper, and we are left listening. 2. The West Mesa Bone Collector, Death in the Desert. Albuquerque, New Mexico, a city known for desert sunsets and dry winds. Winds that, in 2009, uncovered a secret graveyard. It began with erosion. Heavy rains washed away layers of dirt on the barren land known as the West Mesa, a vast stretch of undeveloped sand and scrub just outside the city. A local woman walking her dog noticed what looked like a human bone. It was. Within days, authorities unearthed a total of 11 female bodies and an unborn fetus, all buried in shallow graves. Most were young Latinas. All had vanished between 2003 and 2005. There was no immediate explanation, no eyewitnesses, no suspects, but there were patterns. Each victim had ties to drugs and sex work. Many were last seen in a specific zone along East Central Avenue, an area plagued by crime and known for prostitution. These weren't random killings. The victims were chosen, stalked, and taken over years. Their bodies, later confirmed to have been stripped of identification, were buried in a carefully spaced layout, indicating the killer had time, privacy, and a twisted sense of control. This wasn't frenzy, it was ritual. The media dubbed the unknown murderer the West Mesa Bone Collector. The case chilled law enforcement to its core. The burial site suggested the killer had access to construction or landscaping equipment and knew the land well. Perhaps someone who worked for the city or in real estate development before the housing boom ended. The FBI constructed a profile: a white or Hispanic male, mid-30s to 50s, organized, socially functional, possibly even charismatic enough to gain the trust of his victims. He may have kept trophies. He almost certainly knew how to manipulate vulnerable women, especially those living on the margins. Over time, suspicion circled around several men. One, a former strip club security guard, had been previously investigated for sex trafficking. Another, an ex-boyfriend of one of the missing girls, died by suicide after police questioned him. Yet no charges were filed, no DNA match, no confession. The desert stayed silent. What makes the West Mesa case so haunting isn't just its brutality, it's its invisibility. 11 women vanished, and no one noticed for years. These victims weren't high profile. They were poor, addicted, alone. The killer exploited that invisibility. And then he stopped. Or did he? Police believe the killer may have fled or died, but some investigators suspect he simply moved, changed hunting grounds, learned from his mistakes. To this day, new missing persons reports from the area still spark fears that the bone collector has returned. We may never know who carved death into the West Mesa, but we know this: the sand holds secrets, and the wind, someday, might reveal more. 3. The Phantom of Florence, the monster who hunted lovers. Italy, the land of romance, wine, and ancient ruins. But between 1968 and 1985, the Tuscan hills bore witness to something far darker, a phantom that turned lovers' lanes into killing fields. They called him Il Mostro di Firenze, the monster of Florence. The nightmare began on August 21, 1968. A couple was found shot dead in their car outside Florence. At first it seemed isolated, but over the next 17 years, 7 more couples, all attacked while parked in secluded countryside spots, were murdered in chillingly similar ways. The man was shot, and the woman mutilated. Some say the killer removed sexual organs with surgical precision, suggesting anatomical knowledge and a personal vendetta against female sexuality. Florence was paralyzed by fear. Young lovers avoided the woods. Parents warned their children. The media turned the killer into myth, part man, part ghost. Each murder felt like a ritual, precise, methodical, cold. But who was he? Investigators formed the theory of a lone killer, someone who despised intimacy or had been rejected, perhaps even someone with military or medical experience. Others proposed a more sinister idea: a group, maybe a cult, responsible for the murders. One theory, known as the Sardinian Trail, traced the gun used in the killings, a .22 Beretta, to a family feud dating back to the first double murder in 1968. Dozens were investigated. Several suspects were arrested, imprisoned, and released. At one point, police believed they had their man, Pietro Pacciani, an abusive farmer with a violent past. But despite circumstantial evidence and intense media coverage, he was acquitted. When he died in 1998, the mystery remained. Books were written, journalists investigated. Even American author Douglas Preston, co-author of The Monster of Florence, was caught in the legal crossfire after challenging Italian prosecutors. The deeper he dug, the stranger it got. Corruption, misdirection, obsession. Law enforcement seemed as lost in conspiracy as in truth. And yet the monster was always one step ahead, vanishing without trace after 1985. Many believe he died. Others believe he still walks the olive groves, long retired but forever unpunished. Psychologically, the monster defies easy profiling. The surgical nature of the crime suggests knowledge. The consistency suggests planning. But the choice of lovers, often vulnerable, isolated, trusting, points to profound hatred. Perhaps he saw them as sinners, or reminders of something he could never have. His violence wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. Florence, the cradle of the Renaissance, was scarred by this unseen predator. He made passion into punishment. And even now, decades later, the name Il Mostro evokes a fear that no time can erase. Because the monster of Florence wasn't just a killer, he was a message. The servant girl annihilator, America's forgotten boogeyman. Before Jack the Ripper stalked London's alleys, there was another predator, one older, crueler, and even more mysterious. In the sweltering summer of 1884, in Austin, Texas, someone began killing women in the dead of night. They called him the servant girl annihilator. The name sounds almost cartoonish today, but in the 1880s, this was anything but fiction. Over 1 year, 8 people, mostly African-American servant women, were brutally murdered, often in their own beds. Many were dragged into backyards, assaulted, and mutilated with such savagery that even hardened police officers were shaken. The killer didn't stop there. He struck at white women too, escalating the panic to all levels of Austin society. No one felt safe. Not the rich, not the poor, not even the mayor's own family. Citywide fear turned to hysteria. Armed patrols, curfews, and police dogs were deployed. Citizens slept with pistols under pillows. It was one of the first times America had to grapple with the terror of a serial killer, a concept not yet defined at the time. The timeline was erratic but purposeful, always at night, always silent, often targeting sleeping women in small, unguarded homes. Windows would be pried open with a chisel. The victims were dragged out, sometimes killed alongside loved ones who tried to intervene. And always, always, there was overkill. One woman was stabbed with a steel rod through her ear. Another had her head nearly severed. This was not mere murder, it was rage. Despite over 400 arrests and dozens of interrogations, no suspect ever stood trial. Theories flew: a deranged butcher, a vengeful lover, a former soldier with PTSD. Some even believed the killer may have fled to England and resurfaced as Jack the Ripper 4 years later. It's speculative, but the parallels are eerie. Nighttime attacks, surgical mutilations, no witnesses, and complete police bewilderment. What little psychological insight we have suggests someone deeply methodical. He was able to slip in and out of homes without alerting neighbors. He used tools to break in, but left no fingerprints, though at the time, fingerprinting wasn't yet a forensic practice. His victims, mostly marginalized black women, may have been chosen for their vulnerability, but his progression to white women indicates a killer driven more by opportunity and compulsion than race alone. To this day, the servant girl annihilator remains one of America's earliest and most terrifying unsolved serial killers. What's perhaps most disturbing is how forgotten he is, overshadowed by more famous murderers, buried in dusty archives. But for 1 year, he held an entire city hostage, and then he vanished. No closure, no justice, just a legacy soaked in blood and silence. 5. The Highway of Tears, a trail of vanishing lives. In the dense wilderness of British Columbia, a road winds through more than 700 kilometers of haunting beauty, snow-capped mountains, thick forests, and cold silence. It's called Highway 16, but to many it's known by another name, the Highway of Tears. Since 1969, dozens of women and girls, most of them indigenous, have vanished or been found murdered along this stretch of road between Prince George and Prince Rupert. Officially, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP, recognize 18 cases. Indigenous communities, however, say the true number is well over 80. The victims vary in age, some as young as 12. Many were last seen hitchhiking, some were heading to work, school, or simply to visit family. And then, nothing. No remains, no witnesses, no answers. The vast, unforgiving terrain seems to swallow their stories whole. And somewhere in that silence, a predator, or predators, has thrived. The haunting aspect of the Highway of Tears isn't just the brutality, it's the systemic indifference. For years, families reported loved ones missing, only to be dismissed by authorities. She probably ran away, they were told, or she'll turn up. That apathy allowed a killer, or multiple killers, to operate undisturbed for decades. Some investigators believe there is more than one murderer, possibly truckers, drifters, or locals with intimate knowledge of the terrain. Several suspects have emerged over the years, including known serial killer Cody Legabokov, convicted in 2014. Others point to Bobby Jack Fowler, an American transient linked by DNA to one of the highway's earliest victims. But no single name connects all the dots. The MOs vary. Some women were sexually assaulted, others weren't. Some bodies were found near rivers, others in remote woods. It's as if the highway attracts not one, but many monsters. Criminal profilers suggest a few things. Whoever is responsible is familiar with the landscape, confident and predatory. The isolation and sparse policing of the area offer the perfect cover. And crucially, many believe the killer, or killers, preyed on the invisibility of their victims. Poor, indigenous, transient, women that society overlooked. In 2015, after years of public outcry, the Canadian government launched a national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, MMIWG. It concluded that the crisis amounted to a form of genocide, a blend of colonial violence, racism, and institutional neglect that created perfect conditions for these crimes. What's most chilling is that the Highway of Tears is still active. Women still disappear, and every time they do, the forest reclaims the secret. The wind along the highway whispers names, but justice remains out of reach. Because this isn't just a case, it's a mirror. And what it reflects is how easily the most vulnerable can vanish without a trace. 6. The Colonial Parkway Murders, Lovers Lost in the Fog. Virginia, late 1980s. The Colonial Parkway, an idyllic stretch of road connecting historic sites like Jamestown, Williamsburg, and Yorktown, winds through thick woods and runs parallel to the James River. It was the perfect place for couples seeking solitude. But someone turned it into a hunting ground. Between 1986 and 1989, 4 young couples were murdered along or near the Colonial Parkway. The cases shared disturbing patterns. Lovers killed while parked, no clear signs of robbery, and cars found in eerie stage conditions. Doors left open, wallets untouched, keys still in the ignition. And the killer or killers were never caught. The first victims, Kathleen Thomas and Rebecca Dowski, were found in their car, submerged off an embankment. Both women had their throats slashed so deeply they were nearly decapitated. Oddly, diesel fuel had been poured around the vehicle, likely an attempt to burn evidence. But the car was never set on fire. A year later, David Nobling and Robin Edwards vanished. Their bodies were discovered on the banks of the James River. Robin had been shot. David's cause of death remains undetermined. Then came Richard Call and Cassandra Haley, last seen in 1988 after a college party. Their car was found in a rest stop, clothes inside, but the couple was never found. Their disappearance remains one of the most haunting in the series. The final known victims were Daniel Lauer and Anna Maria Phelps, discovered in 1989 near an I-64 rest stop. Their skeletal remains were found under a blanket. Cause of death couldn't be determined, but their personal belongings were oddly undisturbed. The connection between the cases? Intimacy, vulnerability, ritualistic precision. No witnesses, no apparent motive, and no fingerprints. What made the Colonial Parkway murders so terrifying was the illusion of safety. These weren't isolated alleys or inner-city streets. These were historic sites, family picnic spots, scenic lookouts, the kind of places people felt relaxed, comfortable. But someone used that against them. FBI profilers suggested the killer was likely someone familiar with law enforcement procedures, possibly even posing as an officer to gain trust. Several families claimed their children had mentioned being stopped or followed by someone with a badge. The precision of the attacks, the avoidance of robbery, and the methodical disposal of the bodies all point to someone organized, intelligent, and deeply manipulative. For decades, victims' families have pleaded for answers. Investigators created a task force. Cold case units reopened files. But forensic technology was limited in the 80s, and evidence had degraded. The passage of time became the killer's greatest ally. Some believe the murders were unrelated. Others insist it's the work of a single predator, possibly even one who shifted styles to confuse police. There are theories of multiple killers working in tandem, or copycats mimicking the original. But after more than 35 years, one truth remains. The Colonial Parkway killer was never caught. And somewhere out there, they may still be hiding in plain sight, older, invisible, forgotten. Or worse, watching from the woods, waiting. These 6 unsolved serial murder cases, stretching across continents and centuries, aren't just about death. They're about silence, the failure of systems, the vulnerability of the forgotten, and the chilling truth that some monsters vanish without a trace. They remind us that not all killers wear a mask. Some wear smiles, uniforms, or the quiet confidence of a predator who knows how to disappear. And while justice may sleep, it never dies. One clue, one witness, one breakthrough. That's all it takes to bring a ghost back into the light.